Verifying her worst fear, Anya rushed to the shed. Her heart skipped a beat as she threw open the door, hoping against hope that Moryak was still there. But the shed was empty. The bed she had made for him was untouched, and there was no sign of the little kitten anywhere. Panic surged through her, cold and relentless. Where was he? Who could have taken him? Chapter 1. The sound of waves and a cry for help. The salty breeze brushed against Anya's face as she stepped onto the old wooden pier, her sneakers making soft rhythmic thuds against the weathered planks. It was early morning, the kind she loved the most, when the world still felt fresh and untouched, and the sea stretched endlessly before her, shimmering under the pale light of the rising sun. This pier had been her favorite place for as long as she could remember. It was quiet, save for the occasional call of seagulls overhead and the soothing sound of waves lapping against the wooden stilts. She often came here to be alone with her thoughts, to imagine wild adventures, to dream of places she had never been. But this morning, something felt different. As she walked along the edge, gazing out at the water, a faint, desperate sound reached her ears. Anya froze. It was not the cry of a seagull, nor the creaking of the old boards beneath her feet. It was something smaller, weaker, almost pleading. A kitten. She turned her head, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It was coming from somewhere below, near the far end of the pier where the wood had begun to rot and break apart. Her heart pounded as she moved closer, stepping carefully over the warped planks. The mewing grew louder, more frantic. And then she saw it. A tiny, soaking wet kitten clung desperately to the splintered edge of a broken beam, its small claws struggling to keep hold. The wood beneath it was cracked and unsteady, swaying slightly with the movement of the waves below. Anya's breath caught in her throat. If the kitten slipped, it would fall straight into the churning water. She had to act fast. Dropping to her knees, she inched forward, ignoring the sharp sting of a splinter digging into her palm. "Hey, little one," she murmured, reaching out slowly. "I've got you." The kitten's wide, terrified eyes met hers. Its tiny body trembled from cold and exhaustion, and its left paw dangled awkwardly as if injured. Anya stretched her arm further, but just as her fingertips brushed against the kitten's wet fur, the wood beneath her let out a sharp crack. She gasped as the board beneath her gave way slightly, dipping toward the water. Her heart pounded as she instinctively threw her weight back, barely keeping her balance. For a terrifying second, she thought she would fall in too. The kitten let out a panicked squeak. No time to hesitate. Bracing herself, Anya lunged forward one more time, wrapping her fingers around the kitten's fragile body and pulling it up into her arms. She fell back onto the pier with a thud, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The kitten shivered violently against her chest, its fur slick and cold. She held it close, feeling the rapid beat of its tiny heart against her fingers. "You're safe," she whispered, stroking its damp head. "I've got you." But as relief settled in, she took a closer look at the kitten's injured paw. It was swollen, twisted at an odd angle. Something was definitely wrong. Panic swelled in her chest. What was she supposed to do now? She needed help. Fast. Gathering the kitten carefully in her arms, Anya stood up and turned toward home, her mind racing. But there was one big problem. Her mother. She barely let Anya keep a few pet fish in her room, let alone a stray kitten. She was always talking about responsibility, about how taking care of an animal was a huge commitment. If she found out, she would never let Anya keep it. And yet, looking down at the helpless creature in her arms, Anya knew she couldn't just leave it behind. She would find a way. She had to. But as she approached her house, she heard the front door creak open. And there, standing in the doorway, was her mother, arms crossed. And she did not look pleased. Chapter 2. The Secret Guest. Anya's heart raced as she stood frozen on the front path, the injured kitten trembling in her arms. Her mother's sharp gaze met hers from the doorway, eyebrows raised in suspicion. "What's that you've got there?" her mother asked, stepping closer. Anya tightened her hold on the small bundle of fur, desperately searching for an answer. Nothing. Just my jacket." It got caught on something, she blurted out, awkwardly adjusting the kitten under the folds of her sweater. Her mother narrowed her eyes but didn't press further. Don't forget to wash up before breakfast, she muttered before heading back inside. Anya let out a shaky breath. That was close. But she couldn't risk another encounter like that. She needed to find a safe place for the kitten, somewhere warm, hidden, and quiet. Then she remembered the old shed at the edge of their backyard. The shed had once belonged to her grandfather, filled with dusty tools and forgotten boxes. It was slightly crooked, with a broken window covered by an old tarp, but it would have to do. Anya slipped around the side of the house, careful not to make a sound. She nudged the rickety door open just enough to squeeze inside. The air smelled of rust and old wood, but it was sheltered from the wind. She found an old crate in the corner, lined it with a worn blanket she'd stashed from the laundry room, and gently placed the kitten inside. Its tiny body shivered uncontrollably, eyes half closed from exhaustion. Anya knelt beside the crate, brushing her fingers over its damp fur. "You'll be okay," she whispered, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. The kitten's injured paw was swollen and warm to the touch. Fear prickled at the edges of her mind. What if it didn't make it through the night? She had no idea how to help, no idea what to do. But she couldn't give up. Before sneaking back inside, Anya left a small bowl of water and a piece of bread soaked in milk. It wasn't much, but it was all she had. That night, lying in her bed, she couldn't sleep. Her thoughts kept drifting back to the shed, to the fragile life she'd hidden away. Every creak of the wind sounded like a cry for help. She imagined the kitten growing weaker, colder, alone. She squeezed her pillow tighter, silently promising, "I'll take care of you, no matter what." Morning light crept through her bedroom window far too soon. Anya shot out of bed, pulling on her jacket and slipping outside before anyone could stop her. She dashed across the yard, heart pounding with worry. As she opened the shed door, cold air rushed out, but the little crate was still there, along with the kitten, curled into a tight ball. Its chest rose and fell, faint but steady. Relief washed over her like a wave. But she wasn't alone. A voice behind her whispered, "What are you doing here?" Anya spun around to see Igor, her 8-year-old brother, standing in the doorway. His curious eyes darted from her to the crate, widening when he saw the kitten. "You brought home a cat," he gasped, stepping closer. "Does Mom know?" Anya's stomach twisted. This was bad. Igor was a notorious blabbermouth. If he told their mother, it would all be over. "No," Anya hissed, blocking the crate with her body. "And you're not going to tell her?" Igor crossed his arms, his expression shifting into something sly. "Maybe I won't. But only if you let me help." "Help?" Anya frowned. "I want to be your partner," he declared proudly. "Like secret agents. We'll take care of the cat together." Anya groaned. The last thing she needed was her little brother tagging along. But she didn't really have a choice. She needed someone to cover for her, someone to distract their mom if needed. "Fine," she muttered. "But you have to promise. No telling Mom. Ever." Igor grinned and held out his pinky. "Pinky swear." Anya rolled her eyes but linked her pinky with his. "Pinky swear." They spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies, an old towel for warmth, a plastic bowl for food, and even one of Igor's toy spoons to gently feed the kitten some watered-down milk. But as they cleaned the little creature's fur and tried to comfort it, Anya noticed something terrifying. The kitten's injured paw was worse. Much worse. The swelling had spread, and it was now hot to the touch. The kitten whimpered softly when she tried to move it, its energy fading fast. Anya's heart sank. They couldn't hide it any longer. The kitten needed real help, and fast. Chapter 3. The Vet Clinic and Shattered Dreams. The morning was grey, with heavy clouds hanging low over the small coastal town. Anya's heart thudded in her chest as she and Igor crept out of the house, the weight of their secret heavy on her shoulders, and literally heavy in her backpack. The kitten was wrapped in an old towel, nestled carefully inside Igor's worn-out school bag. It let out faint, pitiful mews every few minutes, its tiny body trembling from pain and weakness. Anya winced with every sound, glancing nervously over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. "This bag smells weird," Igor whispered, adjusting the straps as they hurried down the narrow streets toward the small vet clinic on the corner of Maple Lane. "It's not the bag. It's the kitten," Anya muttered, picking up her pace. "Stop talking so loud." The town was still waking up, but a few people were already out. Walking dogs, opening shop doors, sweeping porches. Anya kept her head down, her heart racing. If someone asked what was in the bag, what would she say? The vet clinic was a small, white building with peeling paint and a faded sign that read Dr. Mikhailov, Veterinary Services. Anya had walked past it 1,000 times but had never dared go inside. Today, it felt like the most important place in the world. She hesitated at the door, her hand hovering over the handle. "You sure about this?" Igor asked softly. Anya swallowed hard. "We don't have a choice." The inside of the clinic smelled like disinfectant and something metallic. Maybe medicine, maybe fear. A woman with tired eyes sat behind the reception desk, flipping through a clipboard. She glanced up as they entered, her gaze lingering on Anya's too large backpack. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked. No. "But it's an emergency," Anya replied, her voice steadier than she felt. The woman sighed and waved them toward the back. "Room 3. Dr. Mikhailov will be right with you." Anya and Igor slipped into the small exam room, closing the door quickly behind them. The walls were pale blue, and a metal table stood in the center under a bright lamp. Anya gently unzipped the bag, carefully lifting the fragile kitten out and placing it on the table. The kitten's breathing was shallow, its injured paw now swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Anya's chest tightened with fear. Had they waited too long? Moments later, the door creaked open, and a tall man in a white coat stepped in, his glasses sliding slightly down his nose. Dr. Mikhailov looked to be in his late 50s, with sharp eyes that softened slightly when he saw the kitten. "What have we got here?" he asked, pulling on a pair of gloves. Anya explained everything in a rush, how she'd found the kitten, the injury, the swelling. The words tumbled out, her throat tight with worry. The doctor listened silently, nodding occasionally. Then he gently examined the kitten, his fingers precise but careful. He pressed lightly around the swollen paw, and the kitten let out a faint, heartbreaking cry. Anya flinched. After what felt like forever, Dr. Mikhailov straightened up, removing his gloves with a sigh. "Well," he said, "the kitten has a serious infection. Probably from a deep wound. The swelling suggests it's spreading quickly. We'll need to operate soon to clean the wound and prevent the infection from reaching his bloodstream." Anya's heart leaped with hope. "Okay. So you can fix him?" The doctor hesitated. "Yes, but," he glanced at the kids, his expression softening. "The surgery isn't simple. It requires anesthesia, medication, and follow-up care. It'll cost around 10,000 rubles. Anya's heart plummeted. 10,000. That was more money than she'd ever even seen. She didn't even have 1,000. "But, we don't have that," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Can't you help anyway? Please." The doctor looked genuinely sorry. "I wish I could, but I run this clinic on my own. The medicines, equipment, they all cost money. I can't cover it all for free." Anya felt like the room was closing in around her. She stared at the kitten, its tiny chest rising and falling weakly. She'd promised to protect it. She'd promised. Tears burned in her eyes, but she blinked them away. "I'll find the money," she said suddenly, her voice stronger this time. "I'll get it. Just, please, don't let him die." Dr. Mikhailov nodded slowly. "I can give him some antibiotics for now. It'll buy you a little time. But not much." The walk home was silent. Anya carried the kitten this time, feeling its warmth through the towel, as fragile as a fading ember. "I'm sorry," Igor mumbled after a while, his usual chatter gone. Anya didn't answer. She couldn't. Her mind was racing. How could she make 10,000 rubles? She was just a kid. No one would hire her. She had nothing valuable to sell. But giving up wasn't an option. That night, as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, an idea began to form. It was crazy, probably impossible, but it was something. She would earn the money herself, whatever it took. The next morning, filled with a new sense of purpose, Anya rushed to the shed to check on the kitten and plan her next move. She flung open the door, her heart pounding. But the crate was empty. The kitten was gone. Chapter 4. The Disappearance. Anya stood frozen in the doorway of the shed, staring at the empty crate. The blanket was crumpled, the small bowl of water tipped over, leaving a damp stain on the dusty floor. The kitten was gone. For a heartbeat, she thought maybe it was hiding somewhere inside, curled up in a dark corner. But after frantically searching every inch, behind old boxes, under broken tools, even beneath the rickety workbench, it was clear. The kitten wasn't there. Panic gripped her chest. "Igor!" she shouted, sprinting back toward the house. Her brother was in the backyard, poking at the dirt with a stick. He looked up, startled, as she skidded to a stop. "The kitten's gone," she gasped, out of breath. Igor's eyes went wide. "What do you mean, gone? It couldn't have just left. Help me look." Without another word, they took off, scouring the yard, the narrow alley behind the fence, and even the neighbor's overgrown garden. Anya's heart raced with every passing minute. The kitten was too weak to get far on its own, unless someone had taken it. Or worse. They split up, calling softly into bushes and behind sheds. "Here, Kitty. Please come out." Anya's voice grew hoarse, desperation creeping in. She pictured the kitten limping through the streets, terrified and in pain. The thought made her chest ache. Then Igor's voice rang out from the distance, breathless and urgent. "Anya, I found something." She dashed toward him, finding him near the edge of the beach, pointing at the sand. Tiny paw prints. A trail of delicate indentations led from the grassy edge of their yard toward the old pier, the very place where Anya had first found the kitten. The prints were faint, some already blurred by the morning breeze, but they were clear enough to follow. Anya's heart pounded as they traced the tracks down the narrow path. The pier creaked under their feet, weathered boards groaning softly with each step. The sea stretched out before them, gray and restless under the cloudy sky. Then they saw him. A boy, a little older than Anya, sat casually at the edge of the pier, legs dangling over the water. He was dressed in a faded hoodie and jeans with holes at the knees. His shaggy dark hair was tousled by the wind. And in his lap, the kitten. Anya's heart leaped with relief and then twisted with something sharp, anger. She stormed toward him. "Hey! That's my cat." The boy looked up lazily, his fingers idly stroking the kitten's matted fur. The kitten mewed softly but didn't try to escape. "Doesn't look like your cat," the boy said with a shrug. "Looks like it's mine now." Anya's fists clenched. "I found him first. He's hurt. We're taking care of him." The boy raised an eyebrow, glancing down at the kitten's swollen paw. "Doesn't seem like you're doing a great job." Igor stepped forward, face flushed with frustration. "Give him back." The boy smirked, clearly enjoying the situation. "Why should I? I found him wandering around. No collar, no name. That's how it works. Finders keepers." Anya's chest burned with frustration. She wanted to yell, to snatch the kitten and run. But something about the boy's calm, confident manner told her he wouldn't let that happen easily. "Please," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "He's really sick. He needs help. We're trying to save him." The boy studied her for a moment, then slowly stood up, cradling the kitten in one arm. His expression shifted from smug to something more thoughtful. "I'll make you a deal," he said finally. Anya's heart skipped a beat. "What kind of deal?" The boy's grin returned, crooked and sly. "I'll give you the kitten back. If you do something for me." Anya narrowed her eyes. "What?" He leaned in slightly, his voice dropping to a whisper. There's something I need you to find. Something hidden in the old boatyard. Bring it to me, and you can have your kitten back. Anya's pulse quickened. She didn't like the sound of this. Not one bit. But as she looked at the kitten, its fragile body trembling in the boy's arms, she knew she didn't have a choice. She had to get him back. Whatever it took. Chapter 5. The Test of Friendship. The boy's words echoed in Anya's mind long after they left the pier. Bring me the shell, and you'll get your kitten back. A rare shell from the closed beach, the one fenced off with warning signs and patrolled by a grumpy old guard named Boris. It wasn't just any beach, it was part of the old Marine Reserve, shut down for years due to erosion and dangerous tides. But none of that mattered. Anya had made up her mind. She was going to get that shell. They sat on the porch steps of their house, the salty breeze tugging at Anya's loose strands of hair. Igor kicked a pebble, his face scrunched in frustration. This is a bad idea, he muttered. What if you get caught? What if that guard calls Mom? Or worse, the police? Anya hugged her knees to her chest, staring at the dusty road. I don't care. Her voice was flat but determined. I'm not letting that boy keep our kitten. And I'm not letting him die because we were too scared to do something about it. Igor groaned, dropping his head into his hands. But we can think of another way. We could. I don't know. Talk to the boy again. Or. He's not going to change his mind, Anya snapped. You saw his face. He's not the type to just be reasonable. Igor was quiet for a moment. Then he muttered under his breath. You're being stubborn. Anya didn't respond. Maybe she was. But stubbornness felt like the only thing keeping her from falling apart. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Anya pulled on her oldest sneakers and slipped out of the house. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of the sea. She'd memorized the route to the closed beach, down the back roads, past the crumbling storage sheds, and through a gap in the old fence where the rusted metal had bent just enough for someone small to squeeze through. She'd brought a small backpack with nothing but a flashlight and a bottle of water. Her heart raced with every step. The closer she got, the quieter the world became. The usual chatter of seagulls faded, replaced by the rhythmic crash of waves against jagged rocks. The fence surrounding the beach loomed ahead, tall and covered with faded signs. Danger. Unstable cliff. Private property. No trespassing. Anya found the gap easily, slipping through and landing softly on the sand. The beach stretched out before her, wild and untouched, dotted with driftwood and seaweed. Somewhere out there was the shell. The boy had described it in detail. White with streaks of pink, shaped like a spiral, as big as your hand. She started searching, combing through piles of shells near the water's edge. Her fingers were numb from the cold, her eyes stinging from the salty wind. Then she heard it, a sharp whistle. She froze. Looking up, she saw him. Boris, the old guard, standing near the fence with his faded uniform and thick grey mustache. His eyes narrowing as he spotted her. Hey! What are you doing here? This is a restricted area. Panic surged through Anya like a jolt of electricity. She grabbed the nearest handful of shells and sprinted, her feet slipping on the wet sand. Boris shouted again, but she didn't dare look back. She darted toward the cliffs, hoping to lose him among the rocks. Her heart pounded so loudly it drowned out the crash of waves. She could hear his footsteps pounding after her, closer and closer. Then, there it was. The shell. Half buried in the sand, glinting faintly in the morning light. She skidded to a stop, snatched it up, and stuffed it into her backpack without even checking if it was the right one. Boris's footsteps grew louder. With no time to think, Anya scrambled up the rocky slope, her hands scraping against sharp stones. She slipped once, her knees slamming into a jagged edge, but she didn't stop. The pain didn't matter. She squeezed through another gap in the fence, her backpack catching briefly on the rusted wire. She yanked it free, stumbled to her feet, and kept running until Boris's shouts faded behind her. By the time she made it back to the shed, her legs were shaking. She collapsed onto the dusty floor, gasping for breath, her heart still racing. Igor burst in moments later, his face pale with worry. "Are you okay? Where were you?" "I've been looking everywhere." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes darting to the backpack. "Did you get it?" Anya nodded weakly, pulling out the shell. It was beautiful, even under the dim light, white with pink streaks, just like the boy had described. But Igor didn't seem to care about the shell. His face was tense, his hands clenched into fists. "There's something wrong with the kitten," he blurted out. Anya's stomach dropped. She crawled over to the crate, her heart sinking at the sight. The kitten was curled up tightly, its tiny body shivering despite the blanket. Its eyes were half closed, and it didn't even react when Anya gently touched its head. He felt hot. Too hot. Anya's chest tightened with fear. He was worse than before. The shell suddenly felt meaningless in her hands. Chapter 6. The Fight for Life. Anya sat on the cold floor of the shed, cradling the fragile kitten in her arms. Its tiny body was burning with fever, trembling despite the layers of blankets. The faint rise and fall of its chest were uneven, each shallow breath sounding weaker than the last. Her heart raced with panic, tears welling up in her eyes. "I can't lose him. Not after everything." Without thinking, she jumped to her feet, clutching the kitten close. "Igor, I'm telling Mom," she said, her voice trembling but filled with determination. Igor hesitated, his face pale. "But what if she's still mad?" "I don't care." Anya's eyes flashed with something fierce and unshakable. "He's going to die if we don't do something." They burst through the back door of their small house, Anya's heart pounding as loudly as her footsteps on the wooden floor. Her mother was in the kitchen, folding laundry, her face drawn with the usual weariness from long shifts at work. She looked up, startled. "Anya? What's going on?" Anya couldn't hold it in any longer. The words tumbled out in a frantic rush. "Mama, please, we need your help. It's the kitten. He's really sick. I found him by the pier, and I've been trying to take care of him. But now he's worse, and he's burning up, and..." She broke off, gasping for breath, her voice cracking with emotion. Her mother's eyes narrowed, her mouth tightening. For a second, Anya thought she would start yelling. But instead, her mother's gaze dropped to the kitten in Anya's arms. So small, so fragile, barely moving. The harsh lines of her face softened. Without another word, she grabbed her car keys from the counter. "Get in the car," she said quietly. The ride to the vet was a blur. Anya sat in the back seat, clutching the kitten, whispering soft, desperate promises. "You're going to be okay. Just hold on. We're almost there." Her mother didn't speak, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. Igor sat silently beside Anya, his usual chatter gone, replaced by a somber, worried expression. When they arrived at the small veterinary clinic on the edge of town, a kind-faced nurse rushed them inside, ushering them straight into an exam room. Anya barely remembered the flurry of voices, the quick movements as the vet examined the kitten, checking its breathing, its heartbeat, its fever. Then came the words that froze Anya's world. "He's in critical condition," the vet said gently. "Severe infection, likely from the injury on his paw. He's dehydrated, and his little body is struggling to fight it off. We need to act fast." Anya's breath caught in her chest. "You can save him, right?" she whispered. The vet hesitated. "There's a chance. But he'll need an intensive procedure. 4 fluids, antibiotics, and possibly minor surgery to clean the infection. It's complicated. And expensive." Her mother's face tensed. "How much?" The number the vet said felt like a punch in the stomach. It was more than Anya had ever seen in her life. She turned to her mother, heart racing, her mouth dry. For a long, heavy moment, her mother didn't say anything. She just stared at the kitten, her jaw clenched, her eyes clouded with thoughts Anya couldn't read. Then, with a deep breath, her mother made a decision. "I'll pay for it," she said quietly. Anya's heart leaped with relief. But confusion quickly followed. They didn't have that kind of money. Her mother glanced at her, then away, her expression unreadable. "Wait outside with your brother," she said softly. Anya wanted to argue, to stay with the kitten, but something in her mother's voice told her not to. They sat in the waiting room, the sterile smell of disinfectant filling the air. The walls were covered with faded posters of smiling pets, but none of it brought comfort. Anya stared at the floor, her hands clenched into fists, replaying every moment in her head. If she'd found help sooner, if she'd been smarter, if she'd done more. Igor nudged her gently. "It's not your fault," he whispered. She didn't answer. Time felt like it stretched and collapsed all at once. Eventually, their mother returned, her face pale but calm. "The vet's working on him now," she said softly. Anya's heart surged with hope. But then she noticed. Her mother's wrist was bare. The silver bracelet she always wore, the one Anya's father had given her before he passed away, was gone. Anya's breath caught. She didn't need to ask. Her mother had sold it. For the kitten. Tears welled up in Anya's eyes, but this time, they weren't just from fear or sadness. They were from something deeper: gratitude, love, and the overwhelming weight of what her mother had just done. She didn't say anything. She just stood up and hugged her mother tightly. But the fight wasn't over yet. Hours later, the vet emerged from the back, his face serious. "We've done everything we can," he said quietly. "Now, we wait." Anya's heart raced. The kitten's fate was still uncertain. Chapter 7. The Cost of Care. The house felt emptier than Anya had ever known. It wasn't just the absence of the kitten, it was the silence that filled every corner, the echoes of spaces that once felt warm but now seemed hollow. The faint creak of the floorboards, the distant crash of waves from the pier, even Igor's usual chatter felt distant, like background noise in a world that had paused. The kitten was still at the clinic, and Anya couldn't shake the feeling that a part of her was missing. Her mother sat at the kitchen table, staring at an old wooden box with faded carvings. Anya recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her grandmother, a small treasure chest that once held stories, memories, and secrets. Now, it held something else. Anya watched as her mother opened the box and gently lifted out a delicate gold locket, its surface etched with tiny flowers, dulled by time but still beautiful. It had been in their family for generations, passed down from mother to daughter. Anya remembered how her grandmother used to let her hold it, telling stories about the magic it carried, though Anya knew the real magic was in the memories it held. Her mother's fingers trembled slightly as she fastened the box shut and stood up. Anya's heart clenched. "Mom, what are you doing?" Her mother didn't meet her eyes. "We still owe money for the surgery. This will help cover the rest." Anya opened her mouth to protest, but the words stuck in her throat. She knew how much that locket meant. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a piece of their family's history. But her mother was already out the door. The next few days passed in a haze. Without the kitten, Anya felt restless, her thoughts spinning like leaves caught in the wind. She tried to distract herself, helping Igor with homework, walking down to the pier, even reading her favorite adventure books. But nothing worked. She missed the kitten's soft purring, the warmth of his small body curled against her chest, the way his tiny ears twitched when he dreamed. On the third night, unable to sleep, Anya sat at her desk with a piece of paper and a pen. The moonlight spilled through the window, casting silver patterns on the floor. She began to write. "Dear Kitten, I don't know if you'll ever read this. I don't even know if you'll understand it, but I need to say it anyway. I miss you. The house feels empty without you. I keep expecting to hear your little meows or see you poking your head out from under a blanket. It's only been a few days, but it feels like forever. I'm sorry I wasn't able to help you sooner. I should have been smarter, faster, braver. But I'm trying my best now. I hope you're not scared. I hope you know that you're not alone. We're all waiting for you to come back home, me, Igor, even Mom, though she probably won't admit it. You're more than just a kitten. You're my friend. My little adventure buddy. Please be strong. Please Please come back. I believe in you. Love. Anya. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her pocket, as if somehow, keeping it close would send her feelings across the distance. The next morning, the phone rang. Anya's heart leapt, and she rushed to the kitchen where her mother answered, her face pale and tense. She spoke quietly, nodding a few times, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she hung up, there was a long silence. Anya's chest tightened. What did they say? She whispered. Her mother hesitated, her eyes softening with something between fear and sadness. There's been a complication, she said quietly. Something went wrong after the surgery. Anya felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Chapter 8. On the edge. Anya's heart was in her throat as the car sped down the narrow road toward the vet clinic. Her hands were clenched tightly in her lap, her mind racing with fear. What if it's too late? What if I've lost him? Beside her, her mother gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles, her face as pale as Anya had ever seen it. The quiet hum of the engine filled the car, but the silence between them was thick, suffocating. Neither of them spoke as they neared the clinic, the familiar sign hanging above the door. It felt like hours since they'd received the call, though only minutes had passed. Finally they arrived, screeching to a halt in front of the door. Without a word, Anya jumped out of the car, her feet hitting the ground before her mother had even fully parked. She ran inside, the door slamming behind her, her breath coming in quick bursts. At the front desk, a nurse looked up, her face apologetic. I'm sorry, there's been a delay. The vet's in the back with the kitten. Before the nurse could say anything else, Anya bolted down the hallway, her heart pounding. She reached the back room and paused for just a second, catching her breath before pushing the door open. And then she stopped dead in her tracks. There, standing in the doorway, was the boy from the pier. For a moment, Anya couldn't move. The boy, she had never learned his name, was standing there, his hands in his pockets, looking at her with a strange, almost wistful expression. What are you doing here? Anya's voice was tight with confusion. The boy hesitated, then stepped aside. I came to check on him. Anya glanced past him, toward the back of the clinic, where the vet was still working. The kitten was nowhere in sight. She swallowed, a nervous lump forming in her throat. How did you know? The boy took a deep breath. I've been watching. I didn't want you to take him. He looked away for a moment, guilt flickering across his face. But now I see. You really care about him. Anya opened her mouth to argue, to demand why he had taken the kitten in the first place. But the boy continued before she could speak. I didn't want to let go of something I loved. I lost my dog a few years ago, and it hurt so much. I didn't want that to happen again. His voice softened, and for the first time, Anya saw the vulnerability in his eyes. I thought if I could just keep the kitten, maybe I wouldn't have to feel that pain again. He paused, looking at her with an almost apologetic expression. I'm sorry. I didn't know you would care so much. Anya felt a rush of understanding. She'd been so angry with him for taking the kitten, for putting him in danger, but now she realized it wasn't about the kitten at all. It was about the loss. The fear of losing something you loved, something that was a part of you. For a moment, they just stood there, the tension between them dissolving. Then, without a word, Anya stepped past him and into the room. The vet was standing over the kitten's small body, his face focused as he worked. But when he saw Anya, he looked up, a faint smile crossing his lips. You're just in time, he said softly. We've been trying to stabilize him, but there's good news. Anya held her breath. His breathing is improving. He's trying to breathe on his own. The vet's voice was calm, but there was a spark of something in his eyes. It's still too soon to say for sure, but I think he's going to make it. Anya's heart surged with relief. As the vet worked on the kitten, Anya stood beside the boy, who had quietly followed her into the room. She glanced at him, then down at the kitten, her chest still tight. You're really okay? She asked, her voice shaky. The boy nodded. Yeah. I think he's going to be fine now. Anya couldn't help but smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who had just won a battle, but the smile of someone who had learned something important. That sometimes, the pain of losing something isn't about the thing itself, it's about learning to let go. They stood together in silence, watching the vet work. And for the first time, Anya didn't feel so alone. Hours later, after the vet had assured them that the kitten was stable, Anya and the boy stepped out into the bright afternoon light. The boy's eyes were tired but hopeful. "I'm sorry about everything," he said again, his voice sincere. "I didn't mean to make things worse." Anya nodded. "It's okay. I understand now. We're both just trying to protect what we love." He gave her a small, unsure smile. "I guess we're both learning how to do that." They stood there for a long moment, the sound of the wind in the trees and the distant crash of the waves filling the space between them. Anya thought about how everything had changed in such a short time. About how she had almost lost the kitten, but how, in the end, she hadn't been alone. As the day wore on, Anya realized something. She wasn't just saving the kitten. She was learning to save herself. Chapter 9. A New Friend. The days had stretched into weeks, and with each passing one, the kitten, now named Moryak, grew stronger. His once weak, trembling body had started to fill out, and the limp in his paw was less pronounced, though not completely gone. He spent most of his time curled up in a cozy corner by the window, basking in the warm sunlight that spilled over him. Anya sat beside him, her hand gently stroking his soft fur. She felt a quiet joy in her chest as she watched him sleep, his tiny chest rising and falling in steady breaths. It was hard to believe how far he had come from the fragile, scared kitten she had pulled from the docks that day. One afternoon, Anya sat with Moryak in her lap as she looked out the window at the calm sea, its surface glimmering like glass under the afternoon sun. She had been thinking about his name for days, unsure of what would suit him best. But then, it hit her. "Moryak," she whispered aloud, testing the name. It felt right. Seafarer. A name that reminded her of the very first time they had met by the pier, when he had been so close to falling into the water. He had been stranded, much like a lost sailor, and she had been there to pull him back to safety. The name fit him perfectly, symbolizing not only their first meeting but also the adventurous spirit that had always been a part of her. Anya smiled softly as she stroked his fur, her fingers brushing against the scar where his injury had been. "Moryak," she said again, more firmly this time. "It's perfect for you." As the weeks passed, Anya found herself becoming more and more responsible. She couldn't help it. Caring for Moryak had awakened something in her. She began taking on more chores around the house, feeding the other animals on the farm, and making sure everything was in order. Her mother noticed the change too. "You're maturing, Anya," she said one evening as they sat down to dinner. "You're taking care of things, not just Moryak, but everything. I can see it. I'm proud of you." Anya smiled, her heart swelling with a quiet sense of pride. She had always loved animals, but now it was different. She had a new sense of purpose, an understanding that she was responsible for the ones she cared about, and that her actions could make a difference. One evening, as Anya sat outside with Moryak, she heard a familiar voice call out from the distance. "Hey, Anya. Can I come over?" She turned to see the boy from the pier, the one who had helped her with Moryak. Over time, he had become a quiet presence in her life, someone who understood her love for the kitten and who had been there when she needed help. His name, she had learned, was Max. "Sure," Anya called back, waving him over. Max approached with a friendly smile. "How's Moryak doing?" he asked, crouching down to pet the kitten. "Better every day," Anya replied. "He's going to be fine now. And I think he's starting to like me." Max laughed, and for the first time, Anya noticed how easy it was to be around him. They had become friends over the past few weeks, bonding over their shared experience with Moryak. It wasn't the kind of friendship that rushed, but something that grew naturally, like a flower blooming slowly in the sun. Together, they spent their afternoons taking care of Moryak, feeding him, cleaning his small bed, and watching over him as he played. Max even brought his own cat over to meet Moryak, and the two kittens cautiously sniffed each other before curling up together for a nap. One afternoon, as they sat by the barn, Anya noticed her mother approaching with something hidden behind her back. Her heart skipped a beat. "Mom, what's that?" Anya asked curiously, her eyes wide with anticipation. Her mother smiled, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "I've got a surprise for you." With a flourish, she pulled out a small worn-out collar with a little brass tag hanging from it. Anya's breath caught in her throat. The tag was engraved with a simple word, Moryak. Her mother smiled softly, watching her daughter's reaction. "I thought it was time. He's part of the family now, after all." Anya's eyes filled with tears as she reached out to take the collar. She held it in her hands for a moment, feeling the weight of it, of the responsibility that came with caring for Moryak. He wasn't just a stray she had found. He was her friend, her companion, and a part of her life. "I don't know what to say," Anya whispered. "You don't need to say anything," her mother replied gently. "I can see how much he means to you. And I'm proud of how you've cared for him." As Anya fastened the collar around Moryak's neck, she looked at him with a new sense of resolve. He was healthy now, and he was home. And as she looked over at Max, who was watching her with a kind smile, she realized that she wasn't alone in this. She had friends, human and animal, who cared about her and supported her. And for the first time in a long while, Anya knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the farm, Anya felt a sense of peace settle in her heart. There were still challenges ahead, but for the first time in a long while, she was ready to face them. She wasn't just protecting the ones she loved. She was building something, creating a life with those she held dear. And she knew, no matter what happened, she wouldn't have to face it alone. Chapter 10. Moryak and his family. The air was warm and filled with the scent of saltwater as Anya stepped into the house that evening. There was something different in the air, an almost celebratory feel, though she couldn't quite place it. As she walked into the living room, her eyes widened in surprise. "Mom," she called, looking around. There, in the corner of the room, was a small bed, a soft, plush cushion surrounded by a little wooden fence, creating a cozy little nook. A collar with Moryak's name tag hung from the bed's edge, and scattered around were toys, a bowl of food, and a dish of fresh water. Anya's heart leapt. "Is this for Moryak?" Her mother smiled warmly, her eyes shining with love. "Of course. He's part of the family now, Anya. I thought it was time to make him feel truly at home." Tears pricked the corners of Anya's eyes as she looked at the little space her mother had prepared for Moryak. He wasn't just an animal she'd rescued anymore. He was family. And her mother had accepted that without hesitation, without a second thought. "Thank you," Anya whispered, her voice full of emotion. "It means so much to me." Her mother simply nodded, then placed her hand on Anya's shoulder. "I can see how much you've grown. You've taught me a lot about what it means to care for someone, or something, and it's made us all better." As the days passed, Anya found herself thinking more and more about how much she had changed since the day she had first found Moryak. It wasn't just the kitten that had grown, it was her too. She had learned what it meant to take responsibility, to love and care for something completely, even when it wasn't easy. Moryak had become a part of her life in ways she hadn't imagined possible. His soft purrs as he nestled into her lap, his playful antics as he chased after toy mice, and even his quiet presence beside her during her studies, they had become the things she looked forward to every day. One evening, as she sat on the porch with Ilya, watching the sun dip below the horizon, she realized how much had changed. "You've really grown, you know," Ilya remarked, breaking her thoughts. Anya turned to him, surprised by the sudden observation. "You're different," he said softly. "More patient, more confident. It's like you're more sure of yourself." Anya smiled, a quiet pride filling her chest. "I think it's because of Moryak. He made me realize that I'm capable of more than I thought." Ilya chuckled. "Yeah, but don't forget, you had a little help from me too." Anya laughed, feeling the warmth of their shared memories. It wasn't just Moryak who had helped her grow, it was the people around her, her family, and even Max. The next day, as summer stretched out in its full glory, Anya decided to take a walk down to the pier with Moryak and Ilya. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the water. It was the perfect day for a stroll, warm, but not too hot, with a gentle breeze tugging at their hair. Moryak padded happily alongside them, his small form darting from one side of the path to the other as he explored the new world around him. He would occasionally stop to look up at Anya, as if asking, "Are we going the right way?" Ilya had his hands in his pockets, walking slightly ahead, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. Anya could sense that, like her, he had a lot on his mind. They walked in comfortable silence, each of them lost in their thoughts, until they reached the end of the pier. Anya leaned on the railing, looking out at the vast, endless ocean. "I never realized how much I loved this place until recently," Anya said softly, her voice almost lost in the sound of the waves. "It's like every part of it has a memory. And now, I feel like I'm part of it." Ilya nodded, though he didn't speak right away. Instead, he reached down and picked up a small stone, tossing it into the water. The ripples spread out across the surface, fading into the distance. "You're right," he said quietly. "Everything changes. But some things, some people, are just meant to stay." Just as Anya was about to speak, something caught her eye. She turned, scanning the nearby edge of the pier. There, just beyond the old wooden boards, she spotted a small, trembling figure, a tiny kitten, much like Moryak had been when she first found him. It was trapped between two piles of driftwood, its fur matted and dirty, and it was clearly frightened. Anya's heart skipped a beat. "Ilya," she said urgently, her voice trembling. "We have to help him." Without waiting for an answer, Anya dashed toward the kitten, her heart pounding with determination. Moryak, sensing her urgency, followed at her heels, his soft mewls filling the air as if encouraging her. She reached the kitten just in time, carefully pulling it free from the tangle of driftwood. It was smaller than Moryak, its tiny body shaking with fear, but as soon as it was in her arms, Anya could feel it relax slightly. Ilya arrived behind her, a concerned look on his face. "Are you okay?" Anya nodded, her voice soft. "I'm fine. But we need to get him home, too." As she looked down at the tiny creature in her arms, a smile tugged at her lips. She had helped Moryak. Now she would help this one. As they made their way back home, the kitten nestled in her arms, Anya realized something. She had always thought of her life as being full of endings, the end of one chapter, the end of one story. But now she knew better. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She had learned that there would always be more to care for, more to love. And in her heart, she knew she was ready for whatever came next.